Hello, good people. Welcome back to the channel. Very good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're watching this from. This is Awakened Africa, and I'm your host, Bemo. On our today's episode, I'd like us to ask ourselves, how was slavery like for black men? Was it only hard labor? Was it only being whipped until blood oozed out? Well, there is a shocking video, a shocking slavery narrative about black men, what they went through in the hands of white women. And this is all about sexual abuse. Let's think about this. Your dad is enslaved, your mom is enslaved, and then either your mom or your dad is involved with a white person, and then you you are given birth. And after being given birth, you become biracial. When you become biracial, now you grow up in the hands of your slave masters. When you come to puberty, you are a grown man. You are a black person, but of a lighter skin. You become a prey, sexually abused by the white women. There is a video. I'd like us to watch that video. Then I'll come back with my comments. But this story is often overlooked, especially in the sexual abuse of black men by their white slave masters, white slave mistresses, the white women, challenging traditional narrative that downplay women's role in such exploitations because many people think that women cannot sexually harass men, which isn't true. I'll give you historical accounts emphasizing the complexities of power dynamics, race, gender during slavery. Acknowledging this painful history is essential for understanding the broader context of oppression. Let us dive into the video. But if you're new to this channel, subscribe. If you've already subscribed, you're a returning subscriber, consider liking, turning on the notification bell, and commenting. Let us watch. I'll be back.
Here's an extensive detail of the abuse of black male slaves by white women. According to a certain historian, few scholars have viewed the relationships of enslaved men and free white women through the lens of sexual abuse, in part because of gendered assumptions about sexual power. This is in keeping with both the standard feminist conceptualization of rape as a tool of patriarchal oppression, as well as the traditional unfeminist notion of women as too weak, emotionally and physically, to commit serious crimes, let alone sexual abuse, and the idea that men cannot be raped. However, it is becoming increasingly clear that women, too, are capable of committing horrid sexual offenses and using sex as a means of domination and control. You are welcome to this video. Don't forget to hit the like button right in front of you, share with friends to spread our black narrative, and then subscribe to stay with the family. As light-skinned enslaved women who were the product of mixed-race couplings were particularly vulnerable to sexual predation, so were light-skinned male slaves finding themselves a great deal the particular target of such sexual exploitation. Apparently, they may have attracted their enslavers more, who in most cases were swooned by the mere sight of them and would exert racial supremacist authority over exercising them as their sex property. As Thomas Buckley found in his analysis of divorce in antebellum Virginia, roughly 9% of Virginia's divorce petitions from 1786 to 1851 were for interracial adultery, with 23 of those petitions coming from white men who complained about their wives' relationships with black men. Peter Nielsen, traveling in Virginia in the 1820s, recorded that he had learned about a planter's daughter having fallen in love with one of her father's slaves. She had actually seduced him. In her 1861 autobiography, Harriet Jacobs told the chilling story of a male slave named Luke, who was kept chained at his bedridden master's bedside so that he would be constantly available to tend to his physical needs, which included sexual favors. In veiled language so as not to offend the sensibilities of 19th century polite society, Jacobs reported that most days Luke was only allowed to wear a shirt so that he could be easily flogged if he committed an infraction, such as resisting his master's sexual advances. In a 2011 Journal of the History of Sexuality article, the scholar Thomas Foster contended that enslaved black men regularly were sexually exploited by both white men and white women. which took a variety of forms, including outright physical penetrative assault, forced reproduction, sexual coercion and manipulation, and psychic abuse. In one example provided by Foster, a man named Louis Bourne filed for divorce in 1824 due to his wife's longtime sexual liaison and continued pursuit of a male slave named Edmund from their community. Foster contended that such pursuits could enable white women to enact radical fantasies of domination over white men, while at the same time subjecting the black enslaved male to her control. Foster also contended that such pursuits were not uncommon, as demonstrated by testimonies from the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, established by the Secretary of War in 1863, which took depositions from abolitionists and slaves regarding the realities of slave life. Such depositions included stories of sexual liaisons between enslaved men and their mistresses. Indeed, there is considerable documentation of white women forcing black men into having sex. Captain Richard J. Hinton, an abolitionist commander in the Civil War, stated, "I have never found a bright-looking colored man whose confidences I have won, who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled, either by his mistress or by white women of the same class, to have connection with them." One former slave told Hinton that his mistress ordered him to sleep with her after her husband died. Foster further concurs with scholars who argue that rape can serve as a metaphor for both enslaved women and men, as the vulnerability of all enslaved black persons to nearly every conceivable violation produced a collective rape subjectivity. Most Americans know that George Washington owned enslaved people at his Mount Vernon home, but fewer probably know that it was his wife, Martha, who dramatically increased the enslaved population there. When they wed in 1759, George may have owned around 18 people. Martha, one of the richest women in Virginia, owned 84. The high number of people Martha Washington owned is unusual, but the fact that she owned them is not. Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, a history professor at the University of California, Berkeley, is compiling data on just how many white women owned slaves in the U.S. And in the parts of the 1850 and 1860 census data she has studied so far, white women make up about 40% of all slave owners. Slaveholding parents typically gave their daughters more enslaved people than land, says Jones Rogers, whose book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, came out in February 2019. What this means is that their very identities as white Southern women are tied to the actual or the possible ownership of other people. White women were active and violent participants in the slave market. They bought, sold, managed, and sought the return of enslaved people, in whom they had a vested economic interest. Owning a large number of enslaved people made a woman a better marriage prospect. Yes, you heard correctly. Once married, white women fought in courts to preserve their legal ownership over enslaved people as opposed to their husband's ownership, and often won. For them, slavery was their freedom, Jones Rogers observes in her book. Previous scholars have argued that most Southern white women did not buy, sell, or inflict violence on enslaved people because this was considered improper for them. But Jones Rogers discovers that white women were actually trained to participate from a very young age. Their exposure to the slave market is not something that begins in adulthood. It begins in their homes when they are little girls, sometimes infants, when they are given enslaved people as gifts, she says. Citing interviews with formerly enslaved people that the Works Progress Administration, a New Deal agency, conducted in the 1930s, Jones Rogers shows that part of white children's training in plantation management involved beating enslaved people. It did not matter whether the child was large or small, one woman told the WPA. They always beat you till the blood ran down. As adults, white women often tore black women away from their babies so they could nurse the white mistress's baby instead. To this end, white women placed thousands of advertisements in newspapers looking for enslaved wet nurses to feed their own children, and created a huge market for enslaved black women who had recently given birth. Why did these white women want black women to nurse their children? One complained she felt like continuously having children and continuously nursing her children made her a slave to her children. That's an actual quote, Jones Rogers says. Some white mothers, such as Jane Pettigrew, cited convenience. She had a distaste for breastfeeding her own infants because it made her a slave to her children. Some black women reported in WPA, Works Progress Administration, interviews that their mothers would always give birth around the same time as the white mistress, suggesting that these mistresses were also orchestrating the sexual assault of enslaved women. Rogers continues, there were instances in which formerly enslaved people did in fact say that their mistresses either sanctioned acts of sexual violence against them that were perpetrated at the hands of white men, or that they orchestrated instances of sexual violence between two enslaved people that they owned, in hopes of producing children from those acts of sexual violence. White women also fought to maintain the wealth and free labor that slavery provided them through the Civil War. The Civil War was America's bloodiest and most divisive conflict, pitting the Union Army against the Confederate States of America. The war resulted in the deaths of more than 620,000 people, with millions more injured and the South left in ruins. As Union troops made their way through the South freeing enslaved people, white women would move enslaved people farther from the soldiers' path. One woman, Martha Gibbs, even took enslaved people to Texas and forced them to work for her at gunpoint until 1866, a year after slavery's formal abolition. After the Civil War, Southern white women sought to recreate slavery through exploitative work contracts. Some even wrote books portraying the institution of slavery as gentle and benign, the most famous being Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, a woman born 35 years after abolition. Yet, as Jones Rogers argues in her book, it was not only white women's ideological and sentimental connections to slavery that made them defend it. Scarlett O'Hara would have been protecting her economic interests too, she says. Scarlett O'Hara is a fictional character and the protagonist of the novel Gone with the Wind, written by Margaret Mitchell. The novel was published in 1936 and was set during the American Civil War and Reconstruction era. While sexual labor was very much a part of British and American slavery, instances of sexual abuse in women's slave narratives were encoded in the language within women's slave narratives. When Harriet Jacobs wrote, "O virtuous reader, you never knew what it means to be a slave," in her Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, calling to her audience even as she challenged their position of privilege, to describe the prevalence of sexual abuse within the institution of slavery. Jacobs not only broke convention, pushing the boundaries of the slave narrative genre, but also shattered the silences surrounding instances of sexual abuse and slavery. Silence, Narratives, and Resistance sheds light on how the stories of black male slaves who suffered abuse at the hands of white women were systematically suppressed and hidden from mainstream historical accounts. This suppression was driven by the desire to maintain a carefully constructed image of white femininity and the broader narrative of slavery that focused predominantly on white male slaveholders and their actions. For this reason, the voices of enslaved individuals, especially black male slaves, were often disregarded or dismissed in historical documentation. Slave narratives and accounts that depicted white women as perpetrators of abuse were seen as a threat to the prevailing social order. Publishing such narratives could challenge the prevailing perception of white womanhood and undermine the image of the virtuous and refined Southern lady. Enslaved individuals faced severe consequences for speaking out or revealing the harsh realities of their lives under slavery. To protect themselves and their loved ones, many slaves hesitated to openly disclose the abuse they endured, especially if it involved white women. However, despite the efforts to silence these narratives, some instances of resistance and resilience have been preserved in historical records and slave narratives. The abuse of black male slaves by white women represents a distressing and overlooked aspect of slavery's dark history. By exploring the power dynamics, sexual exploitation, and physical and psychological abuse endured by black male slaves, we shed light on the complex interactions between race, gender, and power during this era. Acknowledging and understanding this painful history is an essential step towards a more inclusive and just society, where the voices and experiences of all.
Right, good people, welcome back to the channel. This is Awakened Africa. I'm your host, Pam. And of course, when you talk about the historical exploitation of black male by white women, right, is often overlooked in discussions about sexual abuse and power dynamics, which neglects stems from gendered assumptions regarding sexual agency and vulnerability. What if I tell you that some of these white women used to chain their slaves beside the bed, naked, with only a shirt, so that they can be available sexually when they want them? Would you believe me? Well, light-skinned male slaves were particularly vulnerable to sexual predation, often being targeted due to their perceived attractiveness by white women. This reflects the intersection of race and sexual exploitation. I hope up to now you get my point. Historical records indicate the interracial relationships often led to conflicts with adultery petitions highlighting white men's grievances against their wives. This demonstrates the complexities of sexual politics and in the of course in the antebellum South, many Southern women engage in these activities, right? Uh, there is a autobiography by Harry Jacobs which reveals the extreme measures taken by enslaved men to fulfill the sexual desires of their masters, illustrating humanizing conditions they endured. Such stories challenge the notion of men vulnerability in historical context, right? And the historical narrative of sexual exploitation of enslaved black men by white individuals reveals deep-seated power dynamics and systemic abuse. This exploitation, of course, illustrates the intersection of race, gender, and power throughout American history. In instances scholars, including Thomas Foster, highlight various forms of sexual exploitation faced by enslaved black men, including physical assault and coercion. These abuses shape their lives and identities. You know, it's so heartbreaking. You getting enslaved, you don't have your rights, you don't know what to do, but your slave master or mistress, they can abuse your sexual rights. They can abuse you sexually, whatever they want. Testimonies, of course, from the American Freedmen Inquiry Commission reveal the personal experiences of enslaved men regarding sexual liaison with white women. These accounts provide insight into the complexities of slave relationships. Of course, George Washington's ownership of enslaved individuals is well known by many, and his wife, Mother Washington, had a lot of slaves compared to her husband, right? And this shows women, of course, this shows women complexity in this institution of slavery. And these white women were not introduced into slavery at puberty. They were introduced into slavery at a very tender age. You know, there are some stories which say that white women were gifted slaves as birthday gifts. You know that, right? White women played a significant role in the institution of slavery in the American South, often owning enslaved people and participating in the slave market. Their identities and social status were closely tied to the ownership of enslaved individuals. Research indicates that approximately 40% of all slave owners were women, right? White women, highlighting their substantial economic involvement in slavery. This challenges a common perception about women's roles during that period. Marriage prospects for women improved with ownership of enslaved individuals. Of course, if you're a married woman and you have a lot of enslaved individuals, then your status was up there in the sky, right? White women involvement in slavery was driven by both convenience and economic interests. They often orchestrated the conditions that allowed for the exploitation of black women, forcing them to breastfeed their kids because white women believed that breastfeeding their kids was like being slaves to their children. But on this part of these white women sexually exploiting black men, this is a part that most people don't talk about, but it is something that really happened. And you know, there's nothing bad. There is nothing as bad as being forced to sleep with. You know, we men don't like to sleep with people we don't know, right? So when someone forces you to sleep with them, then it's something very, very bad. And before I finish, I'd like to say this. The systemic suppression of black male slaves experiences reflects broader societal efforts to maintain specific narratives surrounding white femininity and slavery. This dynamic serves as a reminder of historical injustices. So, if you didn't know, from today, I'd like you to know that men were highly sexually exploited in America during the slavery period. This is Awakened Africa. I'm your host Bemu. If you're new to this channel, I'll ask you most definitely subscribe. If you're a returning subscriber, thank you. Like my content, turn on the notification bell, leave a comment, stay with the family. Thank you. Peace out.